Hi everyone! I have a finished quilt top here and I thought I would show you how I attach my binding. So I have prepped my binding already and rolled it onto an old spool so I can just stick this on a separate thread pin and unwind it as I need. It's really convenient to wind my binding this way. I can also just store it like this until I'm ready to finish the quilt, which I love. This is 2.5 inch binding, so I've just cut strips 2.5 inches by width of fabric and then sewn them together and ironed wrong sides together for the full piece, and then wrapped it around this spool. So this is ready to go. And then I also have my finished quilt top here. I have already trimmed all of my edges, so it is ready to go. So I'm going to start sewing. I'm going to take my pin out of my spool here, and I'm going to attach my spool onto my thread pin up here so that it just unwinds as I need it. And then I'm going to open up my quilt here. I like to start by attaching to the back of the quilt, and then I will flip and top stitch to the front of the quilt. I think it gives a really nice finish. I much prefer to do it that way. I know some people like to do the opposite, where they'll attach it to the front and then either machine or hand stitch it to the back. I'm not a fan of hand stitching, so I machine bind all of my quilts. So I'm going to take one of my quilt sides here, and this is one of my corners, and I'm going to start about 10 to 15 inches down from the top. And I am going to also leave a tail before I start stitching of my binding. That's about 6 to 8 inches. And that'll come in handy when I finish out here and attach my binding strips together. So I'm just going to stitch 1/4 inch. I'm lining up the raw edge of my binding. See my double fold there? With the raw edge of my quilt. And I don't pin or anything, I just align it as I go, pull off more as I need, and start sewing all the way down. I'm using a stitch length of 2.5. So I backstitch when I get started, and I'm also using my walking foot for this. There's a lot of layers that I'm going through here, and it's just much easier for my machine to use my walking foot, although you certainly could use just a regular piecing foot. So I'm just going to stitch a few inches at a time, adjust my quilt, add more binding. And keep stitching. I'm coming up on my first seam here where I joined 2 pieces of binding, and so I'm just going to backstitch there for extra security. And I'll keep going until I hit a corner. Okay, so I'm coming up on my first corner here. So what I'm going to do is lay my binding strip still aligned, and I'm going to stitch until I'm 1/4 inch away from this edge, the bottom edge of my quilt. So my needle will come to about here. I'll stop, keep my needle down, and pivot, stitching off to the corner, and then I'll cut my thread. So I'm just feeling for 1/4 inch, but you could measure. Needle down, pivot, and I'm going to stitch off the corner. And then I'm going to cut my thread. Okay? So that's what that looks like. I'll have a 45-degree there and a straight edge here. And you can see I've stitched over and then out that corner. Okay? So now what I'm going to do is rotate my quilt 90 degrees so that now the piece I just stitched is across the top and I have another edge that I need to put binding on down the side. So I'm going to lift and make sure that I have this 45-degree angle folded. So I'm lifting this straight up so that this edge is vertical and parallel all the way across. And then I'm going to fold straight back down, just like this. So now I have this edge flush, this edge is flush, and this edge is flush. And I have this triangle. When I let go, I have this flap, and this flap is open on this side. I have two pieces here from where I folded up and back down. Okay, so you can see this is a folded edge, this is an open flap. Okay, so I am going to keep that aligned, and now I'm just going to stitch starting from the top with a 1/4 inch. I'm going to back stitch at the corner, and I'm just going to keep coming all the way down the next side of the quilt. Okay, so I'm coming up on another corner. This one has a label that I have printed and attached. So this is just a square that I fold on the diagonal, and then I top stitch along this edge. And so I'm just going to encompass the raw edges of my label in with the rest of my quilt. So that's not going to change how I do my continuous corner binding. I'm just going to still stitch down until I'm a 1/4 inch away, and then I'll pivot and stitch off the edge. Okay, rotate my quilt, lift up, fold straight back down, and continue stitching. Okay, so I'm coming up on my last corner here, which I'm going to do just like I did all the other ones. And this is the tail. You can see that. This is the tail where I left off. So I only have about 8 inches or so from where I started this. So what I'm going to do is stitch and back stitch so that I have about a 4 or 5 inch gap there. And then I'll cut my thread. So now this is the space that I'm working with that I need to close off. Okay, so I'm going to take my tail here, and I'm going to cut it off at about the halfway point between where I started and when I stopped. Okay, so this becomes scrap now that I've made that cut. Okay, so I'm going to make sure that this one is nice and flat, lay this top one over, and cut it so that there is a 1/4 inch. I'm going to cut so that the top one is a 1/4 inch longer overlapping with the bottom one. And that's going to be my seam allowance. And I'm just eyeballing it here, but you can absolutely measure. Any extra binding is scrap. So you can see here where these two overlap, there's a 1/4 inch difference there. Okay. And it doesn't actually matter which one ends up going on top and which one is on bottom. But now we're going to sew those two ends together, and then it will be the right length for me to finish stitching the binding strip on. Okay, so I have my two pieces laying flat. I'm going to take them both and open them up. And I'm going to match them up right sides together like this. And then I'm going to have extra quilts here so I can sort of tuck that back. And if it helps you to pin, you absolutely can. And then I'm going to line this up under my machine, back stitch, and I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch all the way down. And cut my thread. So now when I open this back, this is the right length to finish out the rest of my quilt. Okay, so now I'm going to finger press this seam open and then fold it in half again so that it fits in line there. And now that this fits, I can put it underneath my needle, back stitch, and continue stitching until I hit where I started. stitch again. Now that is flush all the way across. Okay, so now that we have attached our binding to the back of the quilt, it's time to flip it and stitch it onto the front, just like that. We're gonna have a really nice pretty row of top stitching here. The biggest thing that I like to make sure is that I have a nice full bobbin. It really stinks to have to change out your bobbin in the middle of a nice top stitched edge. Okay. And I'm actually going to pull up my bobbin thread here so that I avoid a little nest on the back side of my quilt. I'm using the same color thread that I used to quilt this for my bobbin. I'm also using it for the front because this is a scrappy quilt and it's a light colored thread, so it'll blend in nicely. But if you're using a really bold binding and you want to match that color, I absolutely would. You're going to see the stitching on the back here right next to the binding, so I like it to be the same color as my quilting thread, but you could also match your bobbin thread to the color of your backing fabric so it's a little less noticeable. Okay, so now that I have a full bobbin, I'm going to get started. Now I don't press my binding back or press it over or glue it or pin it or clip it or anything. I just sort of fold it over as I go. You can absolutely iron your binding away from your quilt here. It might make it easier for you if you're finding that you're having trouble to keeping this consistent. So I'll start near a corner. When I'm almost done, I like to round the last corner and then finish it off and not have to do a whole nother side. So that's just personal preference, but I'm gonna start a few inches down, and I'm going to start by just folding over one chunk, and I'm making sure that I'm pulling it all the way so there's no sagging on the back here, and that I'm fully encompassing my seam allowance here. So I am covering my stitch line here from where I attached the binding. I'm covering that by a good 1/8 of an inch. If you prefer to not be covering that so much, to have a narrower binding, you could always cut your binding strips at 2 1/4 instead of 2 1/2. I have done that before and it's worked out well. I'm also going to be stitching right along the inside of this side of my walking foot. My machine does not have an adjustable needle position, so this is where I have found the best to line it up and get a really nice edge on that top stitch. But if your needle moves side to side, you could of course shift and whatever feels most comfortable. Maybe that's stitching along the outside edge here or here, whatever fits for you. So I am still using my walking foot for this. I think it's easiest. And it's, again, there's a lot of layers that we're going through here. So I'm going to start with a back stitch. And then I'm just going to keep folding as I go and stitching right along that edge. And if at any point you're feeling like you're about to stitch off the edge, just stop and readjust. So I'm coming up on a seam here where I had joined my binding, and that can get a little bit thick, so you can use an awl or some scissors or something to help push that bulk through so that your walking foot doesn't get hung up on it. I'm folding about 6 to 8 inches down, and I'm keeping a hand here, and then I'm also making sure that it stays nice and taut with my hands here. So I'm kind of spreading out my fingers, and then as I sew, I'll move my fingers down. And then when my finger hits here, this is where I had ended my fold, I'm going to scooch down, fold another section, and then do the same thing. Okay. So this is what we're looking like right now. So you have a really pretty line of top stitching here. And then on the back, my line of stitching is again about 1/8 of an inch away from that binding. So I'm coming up on my first corner here, and I want to make sure that I get a really nice mitered corner, that nice 45-degree angle. So I'm going to open up my corner and push my excess here, my seam allowance, into the corner. And that way the back side here shows that really nice 45-degree line. And then what I like to do is fold up from the bottom and then over from the side. And that creates a really nice 45-degree line here as well. And you can pin that. I'm just going to hold it with my finger and sew until my needle hits this corner, and then I'll pivot. Okay, I'm going to keep my needle down and rotate, fold another section. Okay, so again I'm coming to another corner. So this one hasn't been folded forward yet, so I'm going to pop that corner out to get that nice edge, that mitered corner. I'm going to fold up from the bottom and over from the side. So let me show you that first corner that we did. So here's what that looks like. A really nice top stitch line. We have our mitered edge here, and then on the back, again, that mitered edge, and then our stitch line just goes right on next to the corner. Okay, so I'm going to shift my quilt and keep doing this. If at any point your quilt starts feeling like it's dragging, stop what you're doing, fluff it up, shift it, so that you don't end up veering off course. And I can see where I started, so I'm just going to make sure my top and bottom threads are out of the way so I don't get a nest. And I'm just going to stitch slightly past where I started and then back stitch. And then I'll cut my threads. I can snip where I started, and so there, you can see right there is where I started and stopped. That's what it looks like on the back. Started and stopped right there. And we've got 4 nicely mitered corners. Here's the one with the quilt label. So you can see that stitching just comes right alongside that lettering. So that's it. We have a totally bound quilt, and it didn't take us that long, maybe 30 minutes or so. And it's going to be a very happy quilt for a very long time. Hope this was helpful to some of you, and hope that you try machine binding and really enjoy it. I think it's a nice, fast technique, and it gives a really nice finish to the quilts as well. Thanks for stopping in. Happy sewing, everyone.